Κυρίες και κύριοι, γεια σας και πάλι. Είμαι η Marianna Skylakakis, CEO της αθηΝΕΑς και έχω την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να συντονίζω την επόμενη μας συζήτηση στο πλαίσιο της 7ης ετήσιας οικονομικής διάσκεψης της E.EN.E, αυτή τη φορά στη θεματική της ανάπτυξης και της καινοτομίας. Έχω την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να καλωσορίζω εδώ τον Υφυπουργό Ανάπτυξης και Επενδύσεων Γιάννη Τσακίρη. Καλώς ήρθατε. Καθώς και τον οικονομολόγο και πρώην Υφυπουργό παρά τον Πρωθυπουργό Δημήτρη Λιάκο. Καλώς ήρθατε στη συζήτησή μας, που θα ήθελα σήμερα να ξεκινήσει με μια ερώτηση που θα θέσω και στους δυο σας, σχετικά με το πού βρισκόμαστε αυτή τη στιγμή, ποιες είναι οι μεγάλες ευκαιρίες και ποιες είναι οι μεγάλες προκλήσεις σε ό,τι αφορά την καινοτόμα επιχειρηματικότητα στη χώρα μας. Κύριε Υπουργέ, ο λόγος σε εσάς καταρχήν.
Ευχαριστώ για την πρόσκληση καταρχήν. Είμαστε σε μια πολύ περίεργη περίοδο σε ό,τι αφορά, να το πω, και την οικονομική αλλά και την κοινωνική μας ζωή και εξειδικεύοντας στην καινοτομία, η χώρα μας είναι σε μια φάση όπου έχουν γίνει πάρα πολλά βήματα τα προηγούμενα χρόνια προκειμένου η καινοτομία και ειδικότερα η καινοτομία μέσω της τεχνολογίας να φτάσει σε ένα αρκετά, να το πω έτσι, ικανοποιητικό επίπεδο, τόσο με δράσεις, ειδικά μάλλον με δράσεις από συγχρηματοδοτούμενα προγράμματα της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Παρόλα αυτά, αρκετές συνθήκες ανατράπηκαν με την πανδημία, είτε με την καλή είτε με την κακή έννοια. Η πανδημία έγινε ένας καταλύτης να προχωρήσουν γρήγορα οι καινοτόμες ιδέες, ίσως αυτές οι οποίες είχαν μία εφαρμογή και η τεχνολογία παράλληλα. Κάποιες άλλες τεχνολογίες πέθαναν πιο γρήγορα και όλο αυτό μας έδειξε ότι καταρχήν ευτυχώς η Ελλάδα είχε κάνει κάποια βήματα, ειδικά σε ό,τι αφορά τη χρηματοδότηση της καινοτομίας, άρα μας βρήκε σε μια καλή φάση, αλλά μας έδωσε και το χρόνο από την άλλη μεριά γρήγορα να αλλάξουμε τη σκέψη μας και να επιταχύνουμε κι εμείς, τουλάχιστον από τη μεριά του Υπουργείου Ανάπτυξης και Επενδύσεων, όλες αυτές τις διαδικασίες ή τα πλάνα μάλλον που είχαμε υπόψη μας και σε βάθος τριετίας, να τα φέρουμε πολύ πιο μπροστά, έτσι ώστε να προλάβουμε ακόμα πιο γρήγορα τις εξελίξεις και να αλλάξουμε και λίγο τη ρότα αυτών που σκεφτόμασταν για την καινοτομία προς τις νέες εξελίξεις.
Η πανδημία υπήρξε ένας μεγάλος επιταχυντής από πολλές απόψεις. Οπότε, κύριε Λιάκο, θα ήθελα και τη δική σας οπτική γωνία πάνω στο που μας οδήγησε αυτή τη στιγμή, σε ό,τι αφορά την καινοτόμα επιχειρηματικότητα.
Να ευχαριστήσω καταρχάς για την πρόσκληση. Κοιτάξτε, σίγουρα και θα συμφωνήσω με τον κύριο Τσακίρη ότι η πανδημία δημιούργησε νέα δεδομένα. Τα τελευταία χρόνια είναι η αλήθεια. Θα το έβαζα χρονικά από το 2016-2017. Σαφώς η ελληνική οικονομία είχε μπει σε μια άλλη κατάσταση, αναπτυξιακή, και είχαν γίνει πάρα πολλές και σημαντικές μεταρρυθμίσεις.
Many important reforms had been made, even when it comes to innovation. Let me remind you that in 2015, when we came to government, the expenditure for R&D was 0.25% of the GDP. Now it's over 1% of the GDP. Of course, we're lagging behind compared to the EU average, but a great effort was made in relation to this matter. Now, the financial instruments that were then developed, let me say that back then, Ioannis Tsakiris, under his previous capacity, well, we were able, thanks to the EIB, to create a new ecosystem for startups with the E.E.N.E fund, which created a critical mass. And thanks to that, we had a lot of new startups, interesting startups. But now we are in the second phase for those startuppers. So the question is, how can they grow even further and scale up, how they can become bigger in size? This is also very important. Let us not forget that. Now, the pandemic is here. with us. It has created a new situation. We don't know when the pandemic will end, and I think we should all agree on that. But we need to continue. We need to push forward. I'm talking about structural reforms as well, and I would like to agree with what was mentioned by Mr. Venizelos, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister 2011-2012. There are some pending issues. These are historical pending issues. That's what I mention them as. So they need to be resolved. I'm talking about the area of justice that needs to be reformed. Also, public administration is another important issue, and we can dwell on this further. And the question may be how we can have a multiplier effect and how we can make the best possible use of the RRF. Let's not forget that resilience is also important. It's not just recovery that's important. Resilience is also important, and how we can make use of the EU funds. I'm talking about the PA agreement and so on and so forth. So it's not that the pandemic must make us just twiddle our thumbs and do nothing. We have to move forward, and we have to reconsider our priorities because things have changed. The situation has changed. Our needs have changed. So it is within this context that you just described. But we also have a new PA agreement, a new NSRF. So, Mr. Tsakiris, tell us about the specificities, the peculiarities of the new programming period and the tools that will be made available, particularly for innovative companies. Of course. We were the first country that signed the new PA agreement. Meaning, out of all the 27 member states, we were the first. This was another first in the last few years, one of the first that we have achieved as a country. So we are now in the stage of adopting the operational programs. Innovation is part of the OP for competitiveness. Now, the PA agreement is bigger than the previous one. It's 26 billion. And another first is that we were first in absorption. I'm talking about the existing PA. So out of all member states, we're number one when it comes to the absorption rate. We might drop in position, of course, but this, again, is another way to gain the trust of the Europeans. Now, in relation to innovation and the new PA agreement, it will be funded through the old E.EN.E, the new competitiveness, so 4 billion euro. That's the budget, and a large part of this operational program will be used in the classical method of subsidies. I'm talking about various programs, for example, such as Kenotomo. And another large chunk will be used for financial instruments, FIs. And let me continue along the lines of what Mr. Liakos said. We will try to maximize the benefit. We know that there's this ecosystem of startups. We want to make it even bigger using smart money, because innovation doesn't mean it's subsidies and investing in basic research. We need financing, and we need to make use of smart money. And where does the smart money come from? It comes from these financial instruments, and Mr. Veremis this morning mentioned that there's still a big gap when it comes to making use of FIs, particularly in the case of startups. So we will make use of such smart money, and today we actually have the Business Angels Fund. There's an amount that we had given to the European Investment Fund. So now we have the first angel fund in Greece, which will actually be co-funding together with business angels. So this is a new untapped market. And exponentially, this pie of smart money is becoming bigger when it comes to financing innovation. I like your reference to smart money because absorption rate, that's a top priority. That's the absolute minimum, meaning we can't let money go by without us using it. But the question is, where does this money go to? This was one of the questions Greece had to answer in the past programming periods. And of course, we want the money to be well spent, and we want it to be put to good use, not just to have a high absorption rate. So are there any risks in relation to this matter in the next programming period? Meaning, how can we use this money in the best possible way with the biggest possible impact on the Greek economy? So let's look at the track record when it comes to absorption of EU funds. So up until now, we didn't have the influence that we would have desired in relation to the production and development model of Greece. I think that the pandemic has proven or has exposed the fact that we have many inefficiencies, many weaknesses, many shortcomings. This is the reality. The second thing is that the absorption rate of EU funds, and we must understand one thing. The money that will flow into Greece in the coming years, well, that is a huge amount of money. It's never happened before. It's unprecedented. Mr. Tsakiris talked about 26 billion, 32 from the RRF, plus the private funds that can be leveraged, and I'm talking about the loans that can be made available through the bank system. So we understand that we're talking about a huge amount of money, and this money has to be absorbed. Now, in relation to the RRF in particular, there are specific conditions, and on the 31st of December 2026, this will expire, meaning that's the end of the program, the financing period. So we have to have absorbed this money by then. So by the 31st, so after the 31st of December 2026, there will be no money out of that amount available. This is something we have to realize. So this means that we have to run at a very fast pace in order to achieve absorption rates that are high. And the question is, how can we make the best possible use of this money, and how can we maximize the benefits that we can derive from the funds? So we talked about multipliers of fiscal measures some years ago, and how the H measure has an impact on public finance. Now, the question is, every single euro that comes into the Greek economy must yield more than €1. So if we get 100 billion, we should have final results of 120 million for the Greek economy. Of course, the programs that are created by the governments, well, this money is aimed in funds and goes towards companies which can absorb the money. So we can't even lose €1 out of the amounts. And of course, we want to have the right impact, the desired result, because even in the political system, we say all these fancy words, let's go away from consumption and move towards production. It's not something that can be done just by pressing a button. Money can't just be moved from here to there. It takes time, and it takes a constant effort and consistency as well as persistence. So we need to have this change in mindset, and this is all very important. I heard all these previous discussions that we need to change the way we approach things. We need to change our mindset. Well, I think we're on the right track, but we still need to forge forward. What you said is quite right. We're talking about the structural features of the Greek companies, and the small size of the Greek companies has always been an obstacle to there being more oriented towards foreign countries. Are we talking about outward orientations, extroversion? So how can we overcome this problem in the new programming period? Let me express my humble opinion, whatever it's worth, of course. I think this is the main structural problem facing Greek companies. This is something that I've mentioned repeatedly in the public. In Greece, we have 830,000 companies. Let's call them active, 830,000 active companies. Now, big companies, according to the definition of the European Commission, are only 500 out of these 830,000. The middle-sized, meaning having 50 to 250 employees, well, we have 4,500 of those out of the 830,000. And the micro enterprises, meaning from 10 to 50 people, well, that's 25,000 out of the 830. So medium-sized, together with a large size, are actually 30,000 out of the 830,000. So the other 800 are extremely small, from 0 to 10 members of staff. So if we divide the number of employees by the number of companies, the average number of employees is 1.7 per enterprise. This is unheard of. It doesn't exist in any other country, and it's not viable. This is more than obvious. So this needs to change. I happen to be living in a foreign country, and there isn't Bobby the plumber, Mick the plumber. That's impossible. And I'm not joking. Well, there's only one plumber who's self-employed. And normally you have companies and there are 5, 10, 15 people, meaning they have their officers, their secretary, their cars. They give you the invoice and actually you pay it by depositing the amount in the bank account provided by the company. So I think we need to grow. We need to have bigger companies. The government is providing incentives in order for companies to become larger in size. So we shouldn't fall into the trap and say that we're trying to abolish small companies. So we're talking about micro enterprises. We don't want them to have 1 to 3 members of staff. We want them to have 6, 7 members of staff. And this is what Mr. Liakos said previously. These companies become more resilient. The economy becomes more resilient. Entrepreneurship becomes more resilient. If we have a company with only 2 people, well, that company will close down much more easily than a company of 6, 7 people. And another thing that unfortunately, and I'm referring again to Mr. Liakos, who talked about the mindset, and this is something I heard in another meeting. This was mentioned by a businessman. I was really struck by what he said. He said that as Greeks, we don't have the culture to work with others, to work together. And I remember this, meaning never at school did we learn to work in teams. We always used to have individual assignments and projects. So there was no team project. And I think it will take generations for this to change. Of course, this is a skill. And I'd like to come back to the previous discussion. This is something that we miss. So maybe we should encourage this team spirit. And this, of course, influences our extroversion. A lot of companies that are small and they don't work with one another, it's very difficult for them to cooperate if they decide to go abroad. What can the government do to encourage this trend for them to work together and team up? Well, there is a bill which is in favor of mergers, so smaller companies can group together and become a bigger company. So there are incentives in place, but we need to change the culture, the mindset. And I'm not only talking about working together with others as a team. The thing is for us to understand that we can grow. Let me give you an example. I was working in the investment business, and I participated in a committee in the Athens Stock Exchange. And the question is how we could develop the alternative market. So there was zero interest. Why was there zero interest? Because you spoke to businessmen and they believed that if they sold 25% of the company through the stock exchange, they would lose some of their property, whereas they didn't realize that if you have 75% of a much bigger company, at the end of the day, your property will be much larger. So there's this problem as well. And let me say the following. Of course, we need incentives. We need tax incentives. We need investment incentives. We need financial incentives, as mentioned by Mr. Tsakiris. And I think that this should become more permanent in nature. What do I mean by this? When we have a new financial framework from 2025 onwards, if we offer tax cuts or tax exemptions, they should be in this direction, meaning how to make Greek companies larger in size. So a bigger size allows you to compete in the global environment. And I am in the Association of Entrepreneurs. We know that it's a fierce competition out there, and I'm talking about the global arena. So there's a lot of competition, tough competition, and I'm speaking in particular of medium-sized enterprises. So now there's an international trend. We would have been more dynamic had it not been for the pandemic. And I'm talking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So right now, the Greek medium-sized companies don't even know what ESG stands for. Now, I speak from the heart, and I worked in the banking sector. And let me say that if you haven't incorporated ESG policies, the funding from the banking system will become impossible or difficult at best. I don't want to worry you too much. That's why I said difficult at best. So if we're talking about commissions, which are given to large companies, and here we have some big company entrepreneurs in the banking sector as well. If your supplier doesn't have ESG policies in place, this may be a counter incentive, and then, for example, you may stop buying services or goods from that supplier. Have a lot of suppliers understood that? And what about non-listed companies? I'm talking about companies not listed in the Greek Stock Exchange. Have those companies understood that this is before our very doors? It's ante portas. So we have to try to preempt developments, because developments are coming, and they're coming fast. Another thing that we've seen is that a lot of steps have been made in innovative business, the business world and entrepreneurship and startuppers, but we enter into a new phase because the startups are becoming scale-ups and the needs change. So the question is to both of you, what about the needs of this coming period, the period of the startuppers becoming scale-ups? First of all, one thing has to do with SmartUp and the regulatory framework for startups. And I think the Ministry of Development and Investments and the Ministry of Finance have tried to simplify the environment. They've tried to make it easy for companies to be set up and to function. And then we have the financing part. The financing part is very useful because, as you said, some startups grew up, they've scaled up, new startups are in the horizon. So what we're trying to do is to bridge the financing gap from the first idea, the initial concept, not to the buyout. Let me call it growth instead. And moving on to the share capital. This is the most expensive financing part of all. For example, if you want to find people to buy in your company. So we signed a fund for business angels, as I mentioned. This is something new. This is an invitation to fund managers for seed capital. So we're talking about seed capital. And soon there will be an invitation for funds for early stage and so on and so forth. And then we will try to have mezzanine capital and so on and so forth. So starting from Jeremy and the European Investment Fund, we had a small program. Then we moved to Equifund, which was bigger. And now we have almost tripled the capital, which together with private equity, well, that's more than double the initial amount in order for us to be able to finance this ecosystem. Another example, it's got nothing to do with startups. It's got to do with what's happening in energy and the renewables sector. So let me say that we have different actions for funds which are interested in investing in renewables and smart forms of energy. So we're trying to cover the private equity and venture capital universe, and I'm talking about for financing the share capital of a company. This is the most difficult thing of all, and it's the most expensive part to finance. So just one last question. Let's move away from the financial gap. I know we're pressed for time. I think we could say a lot more in this thematic discussion, but we have no time. So Mr. Liakos, could you wrap up and could you focus on the labor market and what needs are being created in the labor market once this ecosystem is growing? We talked about financial needs with the minister. What about the other needs in the market? So you're talking about the labor market. I suppose I think that your question has to do with whether the Greek companies can find the right people to do what they want to do. So we're talking about the labor market that we have right now in Greece. So we have innovative companies that are growing, and of course, they want highly specialized staff. They want people that are very educated. And I'd like to say we have these people in Greece. They are available. And I think that we see that a lot of young people in Greece have gone abroad, and we see that we have excellent, highly specialized Greeks who go abroad and get a job. Now, in relation to the education system, and we've had this long, drawn-out discussion on the education system, it's not enough to have good engineers or good IT programmers. What's important, and this is, we have to have people who understand what it means to be a citizen. So we're talking about general education. This is something we shouldn't underestimate. We're talking about different problems. We had the so-called guardians of the Constitution, and they did all sorts of things. And this means that these people do not think rationally. They do not believe in enlightenment and the general ideas under enlightenment. So the question is what type of citizens you have in a country. And of course, I don't want to underestimate this, but something else that we need to change in Greece, because we like demonizing things, technical education, technical training. Let's not think of it as bad. We can't vilify it. It's important. And let's look at the example in other countries, how important technical education and training is in other countries, and how through this technical education and training one can get a good, well-paid job. Let me finish by saying the following, and I'm addressing entrepreneurs and businessmen. When you want to create a trend in the market, you create this trend by increasing salaries. If you have 700 and 800 euro and then you wish with that amount to create a trend, well, sorry, I think it's wrong. Maybe we need to revise our position on this. Thank you very, very much. I thank both of you. And we now move on to the next thematic discussion, which is again on entrepreneurship and outward